Video game culture has changed a lot over the years, and it has given rise to a number of icons, recognizable figures that are inseparable from the games and genres they represent. Halo Guy and Doomer Chief will forever be the patron saints of first-person shooters. Discussions about early 3D platformers will seldom neglect to mention Banjo-Kazooie, Crash Bandicoot, or Spyro the Dragon, and the same is true for RPGs and Final Fantasy. But there are some icons that are able to transcend their cultural context and become, if not mainstream, widely known by the general public. Super Mario would be an obvious example. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone that wouldn't recognize this handsome face.
Oh yeah!
A more recent and perhaps less savory example is Fortnite. The word has become a household name for the gaming habits of the younger generation, and regardless of any negative connotations, its pervasive presence in the mainstream culture is undeniable. But even among these, I feel that what we're talking about today is unique. It was made with the purpose of usurping Mario's place on the video game throne, and while it was perhaps not successful in doing that, at least in the long run, it didn't need to be. It carved out its own healthy chunk of public awareness, a slice of the scene that it has somehow clung to through 30 years of uncertainty, disappointment, and failure. I am, of course, talking about Sonic the Hedgehog. It doesn't matter if you grew up playing Sega, Nintendo, PlayStation, Xbox, or the Steel Drums, you know who Sonic is. He's the blue blur, the fastest thing alive, and he just refuses to die. There are a number of games in this series that are heralded as unimpeachable masterpieces by their fans. But at the same time, there are some who claim it is home to some of the worst games of all time. Either way, it's impossible to deny that Sonic the Hedgehog has been through some ups and downs. Even so, YouTube is stuffed full of loving retrospectives and impassioned defenses of this speedy rodent, and each new release is greeted with buzzing, albeit cautious, excitement. So as an outsider to the series, I'm curious to find out why. I've only really played 2 Sonic games, and I didn't beat either of them, so my experience with the franchise is very limited. But that does not mean my exposure to it has been. As I explained before, Sonic the Hedgehog is everywhere, so I'm not exactly approaching it with a blank slate. I have some preconceived notions, and I have a pretty good idea of which games are considered good or bad by the community. But I'm not here to uphold or upend those expectations, or to choose a side in the age-old debates. I'm here to experience the games for myself and come up with my own opinions on them. I'm planning to play every main game in the series, so be sure to like and subscribe. This is my first video, and I honestly have no idea what it's going to look like. But let's go ahead and get this hedgehog rolling. Before we really get into the first game, let's talk about first impressions. From the moment you load up the menu, it's clear that the developers were trying to make something special, and I think it's undeniable that they succeeded. Even 30 years later, after all the ups and downs and memes and 06s, I still think Sonic is a fantastic mascot, and his personality shines from the moment he appears. Without saying a word, his cocky, cool guy attitude comes across loud and clear. Later iterations of Sonic have a tendency to be kind of cringy dweebs, but not this Sonic. He looks fun and cool, the kind of guy you want to be friends with, and the astounding visuals really do him justice. Genesis games almost always look good, but the vibrant colors and dynamic backgrounds of this game are really striking, establishing its identity with contagious confidence. The whole game just has a distinct charm, and the love its makers put into it is plain to see even before you start playing. Now that I've finished appreciating the menu screen, it's time to actually play this thing, and I'll be honest, I didn't go into this expecting much. I'm not the biggest fan of 2D platformers at the best of times, and this is an old game. I was expecting a lot of clunk and jank and annoyance, but by the time I finished the first level, I was very pleasantly surprised. The controls are simple and responsive, and Sonic has much more handling than I had anticipated. You're able to pull off some tight platforming, which is good because there are some segments in this game that require some precision. The level design was intricate and engaging, tailor-made for Sonic to run, jump, and spin through. It was surprisingly fun to explore and experiment, and there always seemed to be a reward waiting after a tricky bit of platforming or some thorough exploration. I beat the first level, grabbed a Chaos Emerald, more on that later, and jumped into the next level. I can't stress enough how great Green Hill Zone is as a starting area. It's perfectly designed to teach you how to control Sonic and how to navigate these levels, and it has a great song to go with it. I got to the end of Act 2 expecting a boss fight, and was a little confused when I found myself at the beginning of an Act 3. I was under the impression that Sonic Zones had always been split into two, so this caught me by surprise. But it didn't take long to reach a ridiculously easy boss and move on to the next zone, thoroughly impressed by what I had seen so far and looking forward to what was next. Marble Zone is where the game really starts, and the difficulty ramps up quickly. I lost my first life here, and I was finding it difficult to hold on to my rings. My utter lack of skill really began to shine through, as I blundered half-blind through the trap-infested ruins. Most of my misfortunes were due to mistakes on my part, but I also began to notice a trend of, if not quite unfair, decidedly underhanded level design. I found myself losing all of my hard-earned rings in circumstances I couldn't possibly have avoided. Sometimes it felt like the only way to make it through was blind luck and trial and error, but I managed to struggle through another 3 acts and made it to the zone boss. It was also ridiculously easy, but I still managed to earn my first game over here, though Eggman clearly cheated if you look closely. Fortunately, I had earned a continue, so I got a fresh set of lives and did Act 3 over again, exacting my revenge on the Rotund Sneak. I didn't like Marble Zone as much as Green Hill, but the levels were still fun to explore and I was still enjoying myself. Next came Springyard Zone, an ambiguously themed set of levels full of bumpers and, if you can believe it, springs. It was here that I began to realize something. The harder the game got, the less I was enjoying it. Now, before you hit me with the get good, skill issue, or mad 'cause bad, don't bother, because the game already beat you to it. Imagine you're struggling through this incredibly punishing and maddeningly sneaky level. You've had to play through the game twice to get here because you're too stupid to know how save states work, and you're starting to get a little grumpy. You're just about to complain, and then bam. The game hits you with 4 big blinking letters. So if there was ever any doubt that this game has attitude, there's the proof. Once I recovered from my shock and humiliated rage, I was able to carry on and beat the zone, but my playthrough had taken a significant turn. I was no longer exploring and engaging with the levels as I had been. I was just trying to get to the end by any means necessary. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not criticizing the game for being difficult. Challenging gameplay is a good thing, and many of my favorite games are quite a trial. It wasn't simply the difficulty level that was bothering me. It was the manner in which the game was achieving it. It just didn't feel fair, and more of my deaths seemed entirely unavoidable. And for a game that is entirely built on the premise of going as fast as you can, it brutally punishes you for doing so. Every time I started to pick up speed, I would almost immediately run into some obstacle or tumble down some hole. There's just no way to react when you're moving this fast with a view this narrow. These levels are just not built to let you run, and I found myself constantly checking my speed, which is not what I expected to be doing while playing Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, it may be that this game was designed around level memorization, and I'm sure there are people who can zip through these stages like it's nobody's business. But for a casual player like myself, it just felt like the game was playing me, not the other way around. By the time I reached the end of Springyard Zone, the sense of accomplishment and satisfaction I felt upon beating a stage had been replaced by sheer relief. My favorite part of each level going forward quickly became the exit. What had started as a crisp, satisfying experience had become a frustrating slog, and the clunk I had been dreading began to rear its head. I was only an hour into the game, and it was already starting to overstay its welcome. Having 3 acts in each zone made the game feel slow, though I understand this was probably just due to resource limits. Even the music, which I loved at first, was starting to get grating. The tracks are just a bit too samey and repetitive, though each on their own is fine. But I don't want to be too harsh. I feel that some of the things I've criticized may just be relics of the era. Game design was really different back then, and the intense difficulty was a feature, not a fault. And though it's true that I lost a great many lives in less than honest ways, I'm also very new to the game, and bad to boot. A little more time with the game would probably do a lot to smooth out the experience, but I can only speak to the experience I did have, and these are my honest takeaways from my time with it. In spite of all this, Labyrinth Zone was a breath of fresh air. It was still incredibly difficult, but the slower pace of underwater gameplay allowed the better aspects of the game to shine through, those being the creative platforming and level exploration. Underwater levels have a less than savory reputation in the video game scene, but I have no problems with them in Sonic 1. Hurrying from bubble to bubble is intense and exciting, and there was only one instance where I felt cheated, after floating down this really long tube and having to scramble to find a bubble afterwards. This level also brought back the exploration aspect that I enjoyed in the earlier levels, with lots of verticality and shortcuts and alternate routes. The song was also much better than the previous two zones, at least to my ears. I had a legitimately good time in this level, but even before I reached the third act, I was dreading the boss fight. All of the bosses so far had been trivial, my ridiculous buffoonery aside, but somehow I figured this one would be different. Boy was I right. This was an absolute nightmare. Now, granted, my aforementioned buffoonery was on full display here, as I had it in my head that I had to kill him while he was moving. But in my defense, this very level had introduced a looping segment that I spent an embarrassing amount of time waiting to end, so I assumed that would be the case here. About 20 deaths later, don't worry, I had figured out save states by this point, I decided to just see how far I could go, and sure enough, I reached the end just fine, so I guess it wasn't as brutal as I thought. After taking a moment of consideration for my cardiovascular health, I pressed on to the next zone, Starlight Zone. This is also a pretty good set of levels, with lots of different ways to reach the end and more chances for speed than most others. It still suffered from the same inhospitable level design as earlier stages, and I wasn't a huge fan of the theming or the music, but I was beginning to forgive the game a little bit for my previous hardships. Starlight Zone had my favorite boss fight in the game. It utilizes these levers that you encounter earlier in the zone to launch spikes up at Eggman. It's pretty fun, and it can be hard to predict where the next one is coming down if you're not paying attention. Before we move on to the final zone of Sonic the Hedgehog, I want to take a moment to look at the bonus stages. If you manage to collect 50 rings and hold them until the end of the level, you're given a chance to complete a bonus stage and collect one of the 6 Chaos Emeralds. Now I don't know what the general consensus on these levels is, but I'm not going to bury the lead. I think they are terrible. The way the level tilts back and forth at this choppy pace is chaotic and disorienting, and Sonic becomes nearly impossible to control with everything shifting and spinning around him. Just like every other level in the game, you can easily lose to something you had no way of knowing was there, and my god, the visuals. It's confused and undistinguishable as it is, but that background. Aside from being utterly nonsensical, I mean, why are there birds? It just further jumbles what you're looking at, making the whole experience positively nauseating. The hypnotic display and eerie, depressing music makes this feel more like Sonic's night terrors than a fun reward for keeping your rings, and it's easily the worst gameplay on the whole experience. The reward for collecting all the emeralds is just a minutely altered ending, and for me at least, it just wasn't worth braving 6 of these nightmares. So I didn't. With that out of the way, the only thing left to talk about is the final area, Scrap Brain Zone, and I'll be honest, it's a bit of a lackluster finale. I think Sonic 1 overall has a bit of a theming problem. After Green Hill Zone, which itself is pretty generic, though the stellar visuals do a lot for it, the zones get progressively flatter and less vibrant. Mystic Hill is alright, but Spring Yard is completely abstract and unappealing. Labyrinth Zone is a full monochrome, and the same goes for Starlight Zone. Unfortunately, this trend continues into Scrap Brain Zone as well. I guess this is supposed to be like Eggman's factory or something, but I didn't even realize I was on the last zone until I got to the final boss. It's just gray and flat, with no interesting or fun theme. I'm sad to say that none of the zones lived up to what Green Hill promised, both in terms of gameplay and especially visual design and theming. Scrap Brain's gameplay was mostly unremarkable as well, just more of the stop-and-go platforming I had come to expect, though there is a fun twist where Eggman lures you into a trap at the end of Act 2, dropping you into an abyss. This makes Scrap Brain the only zone in the game to feature a different aesthetic for one of its acts, though it's just a recoloring of Labyrinth Zone's assets. With Scrap Brain out of the way, it's time for the final boss. The game calls this the final zone, but I don't really count it as its own zone. The boss fight itself is fairly anticlimactic, although I honestly wasn't expecting much. It's not very hard and not at all that interesting. You just wait for these pistons to come down and you hit the one that Eggman is in. The hardest part for me was actually noticing that Eggman was even there. But once you beat this, you've beaten Sonic the Hedgehog. You're treated to a short but charming clip of Sonic running through Green Hill with his rescued animal buddies. If you collected all the Chaos Emeralds, this is where they show up. If you haven't collected all of them, Eggman appears after the credits, smugly taunting you with the ones you failed to collect, but I wasn't impressed. He can keep them if it means I don't have to go into the existential hell that is the bonus stages. It is a fun detail though, letting the player know that the game has more to offer. So, that was my experience with the inaugural entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, and after saying all this, I feel like I may have come across a bit harsher than I intended. I stand by the criticisms I've made, but I think this game is fantastic regardless. Sure, the level design gets a little clunky, and the visuals kind of drop off as the game goes on, and the pacing is somewhat of a slog, but I had to remind myself that this was the very first game. Growing pains are expected, and considering that, it's pretty darn amazing that they were able to make this. There's a confidence to this game that I love, like it knows it's the start of something great. There's so much in Sonic the Hedgehog that communicates the passion and genius of the developers behind it. The crisp, engaging animations, the sprawling verticality of the levels, the brilliant character design of both Sonic and Eggman. Again, my gripes are legitimate, but I'm sure much of the things I didn't like were due to limitations on resources, time, and experience. It's a flawed but beautiful masterpiece of creativity and talent, and it's no wonder that this would go on to father one of the most recognizable icons of video game culture. No matter where he may have gone after this, you can't deny that Sonic the Hedgehog got off to a running start. Thank you so much for watching and struggling through that terrible voiceover with me. I'm still very new to this, and I had to try really hard to turn off my perfectionism and just let this be what it is. That being said, I really enjoyed making this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as well. Please feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you thought about it, what I could do better, or just your thoughts about the game itself. Like, I'd love to hear your opinions and feedback. If you could consider liking and subscribing, that would be a great encouragement to me, just a great help. But if you've made it this far, you've already done me a great service, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I don't know when I'll have the next video out, but I definitely plan to keep making these. So for now, just take care, and thank you again.